Welcome back as we talk about 4 steps or 4 key buckets or 4 key categories to revitalize your church. Now those are kind of teasers for those of you who haven't seen the 4 because I keep talking about them but I haven't given them to you. Well, there's a reason for that. There's so much preliminary information that we need to begin and we need to lay the foundation before we get to those 4 buckets. Because if we don't deal with some of these issues, they're going to come back, they're going to bite us, and we're not going to be able to proceed with the revitalization. And so in a moment, I'm going to go with the issue of critics. That sounds like an awfully negative thing. And I got to tell you, when I went to serve as pastor in my first church, I came from a non-ministry background. I was a believer, but to my knowledge, no one in my entire family, my entire legacy, I haven't done the whole genealogy, but my brother's done a lot of it, and there never was a minister, a vocational minister in our family. A lot of horse thieves, a few people that committed other crimes, but none of the reigners were ministers. And so when I went into ministry, I got to tell you, I was clueless. I had served as a deacon in a church. I'd even served in a Baptist church on a pastor search committee. So I'd been part of that process. But I had a great deal of naivete about what it meant to be right in the bowels, right in the middle of all of the inner workings of a church. And so I go to seminary, and about my second year in seminary, I get a call from a church that says they're looking for a pastor. Would I like to come preach? They didn't say they wanted to interview, they just wanted me to preach. And I've mentioned the little church in southern Indiana, so I went to preach, and they had said they weren't going to interview me. They didn't care about my theology or my beliefs or my practice. They just wanted to hear me preach. And they said, we'll probably vote on you after you preach. So I preached, and everybody left. I had a meeting with the entire deacon body. His name was Merle. And I said to Merle, I thought you were going to vote on me. And Merle said, well, you're just bad. You're just a lousy preacher. And so I took that as a word of discouragement, and I walked away. But as I was walking away, he yelled, he said, well, come back next week because we don't have anybody else to preach. And I went back the next week, second week. I went back the third week. They still didn't vote. Finally, 7 consecutive weeks, they decided to vote on me. So I said, why are y'all voting on me? Did I finally preach a good sermon? He said, no, you're still a bad preacher. But it's going to be Palm Sunday next Sunday, and we need somebody to preach in time for Easter. So they voted on me. And that's when I got my vote of 6-1. Think about it. I was so bad that I could not get a unanimous vote with only 7 people. I still entered into that pastorate, that role of pastor, with a lot of naivete. Here was my perspective. We're all Christians. We're going to love one another. We're going to sing hymns. We're going to do for one another. And there's going to be no negativity at all. And I had no negativity until about the 3rd day of being a pastor. And even with only 7 people, and the person that was a critic of mine was not even the one who voted against me. It was someone else. And I want to tell you, I was floored. Somebody's criticizing me. I'm a pastor. I didn't think these things happened. And then I would come to learn that the type of people that I was serving as pastor were sinners. They made mistakes. They had critical spirits at times. And you know what I found out? So did I. I was imperfect, sinner, still am, made mistakes, and have a critical spirit at times. And I wish that I'd had the maturity to deal with that way back then. And I tell you, it was like a 2x4 upside the head. I just had to carry that burden that someone actually did not like me. And the only time I got over it was when the next critic came, and that reminded me how much that person didn't like me, and I forgot about the one before it. The thing about critics is it is a reality in any organization. And people say, well, the church should be different. Well, maybe it should, but read the Bible. Read about the church at Corinth and all of the faults and problems and issues that they were having. Christians suing Christian, fights over spiritual gifts, immorality in the church. That was in the 1st century AD. That was one church. We cannot be so naive to think that criticisms are not going to come our way, especially when we're in positions of leadership. Here's the reality. Revitalization means the church is changing. And if the church is changing, you are going to have critics. So if you are a viewer or listener who is a pastor, a staff member, or a key lay leader in the church, get ready for more criticisms. You're probably already dealing with them, so I'm not telling you anything new. But revitalization is a new round, it's a new issue, because there are changes after changes after changes that take place, even if the process is slow and even if it is incremental. So I think it is vital that we deal with this issue of critics. Now, I got to try to grasp who you might be. Again, I've been presuming that many of you are pastors, and then some of you are staff members, and then some of you are lay leaders. I've been presuming that most people who'll be listening to a consultation video allowing me to come into the presence of your church or leadership team, or just you one-on-one, that you are leaders in the church in some capacity. And so I'm going to just give you all levels of assurance that there will be more criticisms as you lead to revitalization. So we've got to talk about how to deal with those critics in such a way that the revitalization can continue. Now, you know what I always like to do? I like to review. Why do I like to review? Because redundancy helps us to remember. So before we talk about how you deal with critics, let's remember the 7 things that can stop you from leading revitalization in the previous module. Spiritual discipline diversions, not staying focused upon what God wants us to personally. Main thing diversions, where we're doing a lot of good things, but not the main thing. Lack of hope and faith. Just not believing that God can do it. And I gave you biblical examples from Ezra and from Haggai and others. We talked about the pastor life cycle, and we went through the honeymoon, the crisis, the fruit, and the reset stages, and why it's important to have continuity of leadership. Not willing to work or execute. Revitalization is a challenge, and it requires people to be firmly dedicated and committed to that work. Poor relational skills, something that we will expand upon before we get done with this whole revitalization issue. An attitude of blame. If only that pastor would do this and things would be okay. If only that church member would do this and things would be okay. Which has led us to this issue of critics. Critics are a reality. You cannot eradicate them unless you have autocratic rule and don't allow anyone to say anything negative, which of course is not biblical at all. In a church where there's really revitalization taking place, criticism will as well. Let's talk about the 7 ways that we can deal with the critics. Let's talk about the 7 ways you can deal with the critics. Number 1, don't take most of the criticisms personally. That's kind of hard, you know? When somebody is criticizing you for something in a leadership role, and for you not to take it personally. I want to give you an example. I had a critic in a church. I've had many critics in churches where I served as pastor, but this is just one critic. And this critic was constantly on my case. He was criticizing me for my leadership, for my preaching. He was criticizing me for my length of my sermon, whether it's 20 minutes or 30 minutes or anything in between. It was just a constant barrage, and I did not like him. And I just thought he was a personal attacker. And he was personally attacking me. He would say things in church business meetings. He would write notes. He would say things about my family. And that's really where it got to me. And I was praying one night, and I hope it wasn't an imprecatory psalm that I was praying, but I hope it was that I was just praying, God, help me deal with this. Help me deal with this critic. And again, I didn't hear an audible voice. There was not handwriting on the wall, but I had a sense that God was leading me to pray for that person. Because I remember arguing with God. You want me to pray for him and he's been such a jerk? Pray for him. You want me to pray for him? He said this about my wife and my boys. Pray for him. You want me to pray for him when he stood up in a church business meeting and said this about me to these people? Pray for him. I didn't like it. My emotions weren't there, but I prayed for him. I wish I could say the next day everything was okay, but 20, 30 days later, maybe a month later, I'm meeting with this guy, and he's just railing on me. And I look him in the face, and I said, I have been praying for you, not about you. I've been praying for you. is there something I can pray for you now? And he just broke down and started crying. And he unloaded all of these personal and business issues that were just tearing him up on the inside. Did that excuse him from being a critic of me personally? No. But it helped me to understand him more. It helped me to understand that I was his target, but just because that was convenient. And though it didn't eradicate all of his criticisms immediately, I continued to pray for him. And when I finally left that church, he cried again. But he cried because I was leaving, and he said he was going to miss me. My attitude at the onset could have been, how dare this man attack me? How dare he say these things about me? And that really was my attitude, quite frankly. But when I began to pray for him, I understood that it wasn't personal. That really is the segue to number 2, and that is to pray for the critic. You're going to get emails of criticisms. And I want to tell you what breaks my heart with pastors and the criticisms they receive today in the world of social media. I have talked with more pastors who are getting criticisms in social media where the world can see, whether it's on a Facebook or whether it's a tweet that goes out. And so that means not only is the pastor or staff member seeing it, but much of the world is seeing it. And they feel defenseless. They don't know how to respond. And the only way I know sometimes to tell a person who's in a key leadership how to respond is pray for that critic. Pray for that person even if you don't feel like it. You might absolutely be surprised that there are issues in his or her life that have nothing to do with you, and even if it has to do with you, so be it. You're not perfect either. Pray for that person. If you're the pastor, if you're serving on staff, you are the under shepherd that God has placed there. That not only includes all the sheep that aren't any problem, but that includes all the black sheep as well. Those who are presenting problems to you in your life. Pray for that critic. You know, the third of these is easier to say than to do, but develop a winsome spirit. Develop a spirit where when someone criticizes you, you're able to demonstrate love for them. You're able to maybe not laugh at them, but to laugh at yourself. To develop a spirit that is, as people come at you, that you have prayed that the fruit of the Spirit may be manifest in your life, that they can see joy and peace, that they can see that even in tough times that you'll rise above it. Some of the greatest leaders that I have read about have been in the Bible. You ever read the story of Joseph? And all the things that he went through, and yet he had this winsome spirit that rose above all of these issues. Have you ever read the story of David and how he was being chased to even be killed by King Saul? And yet he maintained this winsome, humble spirit, even with the fiercest of critics, and in this case was actually trying to take his life. Pray that God will give you that spirit where you can rise above it, that you can have, to quote Paul in his letter to the church at Philippi, you can have the peace that passes all understanding. Understand that a winsome spirit can often diffuse some of the harshest of critics. A fourth way we deal with criticism is to be transparent. You know, one of the reasons that we in leadership have critics is because sometimes people think that we are not forthcoming in things where we should be forthcoming. Sometimes it is issues dealing with the organization or the church, and sometimes it is dealing with personal issues of ourselves. A transparent leader is a leader who is a leader without guile. That person is a leader that really has nothing to hide and is not hesitant to mention, I am a leader that has my faults. I'm a leader with these weaknesses. I am someone that doesn't have my act totally together. To be able to be transparent and to say that you're not perfect either can often diffuse the critics who want to attack you because they perceive that you have not got to that point where you see yourself clearly in the mirror. Another issue that is closely related to transparency is to pray for your own attitude. That's very similar to praying for your critics, but it's just an overall disposition. Sometimes when you have time, go to Philippians 4 and read that whole section about rejoicing in the Lord. Rejoice in the Lord always. Let your gentleness be made known to all. Have you ever looked at that? You ever looked at that passage about what it means to be gentle, what that word means? It means to have a spirit of lack of antagonism, a non-fighting spirit, not a spirit that doesn't have conviction, but a spirit that is not antagonistic. And sometimes we create our own problems and we make it worse because our attitude adds fuel to the fire. And whether we are a layperson that is imposing criticism upon leadership in the church, whether we are a leader who has angst about what is taking place in the church, sometimes the issue can be addressed just by praying for our own attitude. Now, this may seem like a kind of a detour when we're dealing with revitalization. But I got to tell you, folks, revitalization is about personal issues. Revitalization is about spiritual issues within the person. And we cannot even begin to talk about those 4 buckets or 4 issues or 4 steps of revitalization until we who are leaders are able to adjust to our attitude in God's eyes. Pray for your own attitude. Focus on the majority. Now, here's what I mean. Most pastors who leave because of critics leave over a handful of critics, 4, 5, or 6 at most. And they leave even though the majority support them. And why is that? That's because critics can be so loud, critics can be so painful, critics can be so personal. Focus on the majority. Focus upon those people who are your supporters. I spent too much time in pastoral ministry dealing with critics. I'm not saying I shouldn't have dealt with critics. I'm not saying that I shouldn't have been responsive to them. But I agonized over them too long. I worried about them too much instead of focusing upon the vast majority who were supportive of my leadership and ministry there. Focus on the majority of the people who support you, who love you, who are there. Don't neglect those who are in opposition, but focus on the majority. Now, number 7 is kind of a summary statement. Number 7 summarizes much of what we've said to this point, and I call it look in the mirror. I'm not sure who told me about this phrase to begin with. I think I read a book about the man in the mirror, so that was part of it. But I know that my number 2 guy at Lifeway, Brad Wagner, has mentioned this many times. He said the healthiest people relationally are those who are willing to look in the mirror. Now, I don't like looking in the mirror literally because what I see scares me. I see my face. But that's not what we're talking about when we say looking in the mirror. When we talk about looking in the mirror, we're saying a willingness to see who we are. Maybe even better, a willingness to see how God sees us. That we're willing to open up and say, I want to know me, God, even as you know me. And that may mean, as I've indicated in other times, that you have someone speak truth into your life. That may mean that you have a confidant or a mentor, someone who walks alongside you that will speak those things of encouragement and those words of truth. Looking in the mirror means that you get a perspective of who you are. And you know what I find out when I look at the mirror? I'm not nearly as good as I first thought I was. I'm not nearly as spiritual, this leader, this person without guile. I am a messed up sinner in need of a Savior. And so when I look in the mirror, what I just realize is that I have the grace of my Lord Jesus Christ that has covered my sins through His death on the cross. And that's all I have. Because without that, I have nothing. My sins have been forgiven. I have been given eternal life because I have trusted in by faith by what He has done on the cross. That's why that text says that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. When Paul was writing the Roman church, he meant everyone, everybody. And you know what that means? Me and you. You pastor, you staff member, you church leader, you Tom Rayner. And when I began to grasp the grace of God, that He sent His Son to die for me, and I have trusted in that, and I have, by faith, received that gift of grace, unmerited favor, then I start to begin seeing people through those eyes. How can I not love others when Christ loved me no matter what? That's how I look in the mirror, and that's how I begin to love my critics. So where are we? We've gone through this whole issue of responding to critics. I don't know if you skipped over this video and maybe you're only at the end of it because you don't really want to hear all of these issues about criticism because they're so painful to you, but I hope you've stayed with me the whole time. And I hope you realize that these first 3 videos, these first 3 modules on this consultation with you are critically important because they're providing the foundation of everything that we're about to do and go forward. And I promise you, when you get the next delivery of videos, which is going to be video 4, video 5, video 6, the next 3 modules, we're going to go into some of those practical issues, and we're going to be talking about those buckets, those steps, those 4 major processes. But I couldn't get there without doing this first. I couldn't get there without dealing with these issues. So thank you for being with me to this point, and thank you for a willingness to hear this and to even let God examine you. Now, I like to give different warnings. I like to give a heads up on things that are coming up. So here's my revitalization warning to you. How you respond is as important as what you say to begin. How you respond is as important as what you say to begin. And I'm specifically referring to how do you respond to critics. It's not limited to that, but how do you respond to critics? Are you winsome? Are you willing to show and demonstrate love? Are you willing to see them through the eyes of Christ and His death on the cross? Are you defensive and you're acting in a counterattack mode? So revitalization, pray that God will give you that winsome spirit. And as a result, you'll be that kind of leader who's ready to move forward, because revitalization, this is redundant, revitalization means change, and change means critics. Okay, it's time to review, because I don't want us to go away from this without making certain that we got it all down. You can listen to it again, you can watch it again, you can look at your notes. You have the option to do a bunch of different things, but let's review what we've learned. We've talked about 7 ways to deal with critics. Don't take most of the criticisms personally. Yeah, right. Well, we talked about why. Pray for the critic. Again, my personal testimony is that has been one of the most revolutionary things that God has given me, to not only pray for those that love me, but to pray for those that I might perceive are my enemies. Develop a winsome spirit. You cannot do that in your own human power, but God can give you that winsome spirit. Be a transparent leader. That only means transparent with everything that goes on in the church. That means being transparent about yourself. Of course, there are limits to transparency. You don't want to go overboard. But be that transparent leader that is willing to say, I'm not perfect. And maybe the real negative illustrations that if you're a pastor that you use in your sermon, some of them relate to you instead of to other situations. We said pray for your own attitude. There's a lot of prayer in this. But as you're praying for your winsome spirit, you're praying that you'll have an attitude of love toward those who criticize you. Focus on the majority. Focus upon those who love you. Yeah, you have to deal with the minority, but remember that. It's usually just a few. Remember, you've got a lot of support, and too many pastors have given up too quickly. Too many church members have left the church too quickly over a few statements by a few members. There's no such thing as a perfect church, especially when you're in the process of revitalization. Focus on the majority. And the 7th thing we looked at is look in the mirror. That phrase about letting God see you as you are, and then letting yourself ask God what He saw. And that self-revelation, or God's revelation of yourself to you, will give you an idea of who you really are, and you'll understand grace even at a greater depth, which will cause you to be more responsive to these critics, more responsive in a godly way. Okay, you've made it through the first 3 modules. You've made it through this introductory level that we delivered to you in the first go-round. I know that many of you are here because you said Tom Rainer's going to give you some practical tools for revitalization. And you've had to go through three modules where we've been laying the foundation, necessary foundation, but at the same time, preparatory for everything that is about to take place. I will be referring to the four-legged stool of revitalization in the next module and from this point forward. Now, what does that mean? When you have a picture of a stool, and you're going to see the picture on the screen, when you have the picture of the stool, you've got the seat of the stool, and then you've got the four legs going to it. Well, as you can see in the picture, that seat of the stool is revitalization itself. And it rests upon four legs. We're using a lot of metaphors here. Legs, process, steps, buckets, but it's all the same thing. And this four-legged stool, these are the four areas, as we've looked at churches that have revitalized all across the nation, these are the four areas that have led to revitalization. In almost every church that we've looked at that has gone through true revitalization, we can put every action, everything done in one of those four legs of this four-legged stool. So you have made it with us to this point. You have come through all of the preparatory information. You have come through all of the introduction. And now we're about to get to some of the nitty-gritty of what it means to revitalize the church. So it won't be long before you'll be getting these next videos. The next set of delivery, we'll get 3 more. I want you to get ready for them. I want you to pray for them. Take time to do them and see how God is going to begin to do things in your church, because now we're getting down to the basics. Here is what God uses to lead to revitalization, and it can happen in your church. Thanks for being with me. I'll see you in the next video.